Good evening, everybody. This is Roger Williams, and welcome to History Author Talks this evening. I'm so pleased to have you join us this evening, and I think we've got a very, very special show for us this evening. Before we introduce our guests this evening, I'd like to just give you some updates about what is going on in the public history world. I went to a wonderful conference up at Fort Plain along the Mohawk Valley Conference of the American Revolution. And in the last 8 weeks, in May and June, we've been doing a lot of school programs over at Washington Crossing Historic Park. Many of our historic sites spend a lot of time in May and June doing school programming, and I was very pleased. I love doing this with the kids. Get dressed up in my uniform and go talk to the kids about the American Revolution. All the more reason I want to remind everyone to be sure that you support your historic sites. The beeping that you heard is that I'm doing this out on my front porch this evening. So I hope you don't mind hearing the birds from a little while and maybe a car horn from time to time. So this evening, we are going to be joined by my friend and award-winning author David O. Stewart to talk about his new novel, The Burning Land. And we are going to be lucky because David's going to read to us some pages from his novel, but we're also going to talk about the process of fiction. As always, if you have questions, you will be able to use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen if you have questions for David. But now I'd like to introduce you all to my friend, David Stewart. David is an award-winning author of many historical books of nonfiction, including The Summer of 1787 and a most recent biography of George Washington, which I have been telling people really is the best single volume biography of George Washington that everyone really ought to read, along with another of his other books, which you can find on his website, which is davidostewart.com. Welcome, David Stewart. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Well, thanks, Roger. It's wonderful to be here. I'm delighted you're doing this show. It's you've done it a while now, and it seems to be catching on.
This is my COVID show that just keeps on going, right? I've been having a great time with it. So, David, I first became a fan of reading your books of nonfiction. Let's just, for those of you who don't know you, let's talk about how you got to writing first nonfiction, and then we'll talk about how you went into the fiction field.
Oh, well, it's too long a story, but I was a practicing lawyer for many years, doing trial and appellate work, and I loved it. And then I didn't. So I needed to find something else to do. And I just thought I'd like to write some books, and set out to do it, and was lucky enough to pull it off. I started thinking I would write the great American novel, and it turned out I hadn't. So I then moved to nonfiction and had some ideas, books kind of growing out of my law practice. Like I did a lot of constitutional law in summer of 1787 is about the Constitutional Convention. And that was going fine. And then I ran into this story I really wanted to tell, but I couldn't find out enough about it to write it as a nonfiction book. This was about the Lincoln assassination conspiracy, the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy. So it finally occurred to me, well, I could do it as fiction, and sort of make some stuff up and create characters who would see it through. And that turned out to be a real hoot. And I'll be blunt, I think I did better when I had a historical setting. I sort of had guardrails as to what the story was. It wasn't just me and my wacky imagination. And so I did 3 books with those sort of historical mysteries, people dealing the turn of the 20th century with some of the lingering mysteries of our time or of that time. And these books, the 2 we're going to talk about tonight, come out of family stories. And I think most people who get interested in history or are interested in history, sooner or later turn on their own families and try to find out what really happened. And I did that as well. And like usual, I didn't know enough to write nonfiction books about them. So I turned to fiction again. And I just quickly want to do a shout out to my old friend, Marianne Keefe. I'm delighted she's here. And it's nice to see that Larry Kidder is tuned in as well. Thank you.
So let's talk about those guardrails for a minute that you mentioned earlier, because one of the criticisms that I run into when I talk to my little coffee clutch of historians, I hang around a lot of historians. I'm not really a historian. I just pretend to be one. And
You play one on Zoom.
I mean, I play one on Zoom, exactly. But the criticism that you hear among historians is, well, you know, fiction is just made up stuff, and they have a difficulty getting through trying to appreciate the dialogue, because these people didn't really say these things. But with the Lincoln conspiracy and the Paris conspiracy, Woodrow Wilson, and Babe Ruth, you, in all of each of their time periods that you select, and we'll talk about the Overstreet Saga as we move along here, but you seem to get a lot of the nuance of fashion and language and what is going on in the news, you know, around in the world of your character. So we're reading, don't take this in a disparaging way, soap operas, but at the same time we're learning.
Yeah,
that's different.
just quickly, your historian friends need to admit one thing, and historical novelists need to acknowledge another. For historical novelists, they need to understand that the things we know, that we really know are true, you really shouldn't fool with. That's my view of historical fiction. You know, the saying I use is, you know, you can make up a lot, but Lincoln has to be tall. I mean, you just can't fool with the stuff we know. But for the historians, they need to recognize that most of history is silence. We don't know what happened. You know, I did this book on George Washington and read, you know, 75 volumes of his papers. But on any given day, you know, I might know what he did for an hour and a half, and, you know, the other 22 and a half hours are unaccounted for. And that is where the historical novelist lives, in trying to understand what could have happened, even what very likely did. Sometimes I read a historical novel and I'll think, that's a better explanation of events than I've ever seen. I mean, Gore Vidal in his novel Burr wrote a better explanation of the Hamilton-Burr duel than any nonfiction book I've seen on the subject. And I ended up adopting it in my own nonfiction book, just as the most plausible hypothesis. In any event, to find out how to, you know, how to characterize, how to present the era, you do have to do some research, and there are some great tools. I try to read novels written during the era, so I get a sense of the language and the rhythms of the language. And you know, Google has this amazing tool called Ngram, and it will tell you, you know, if you want to know the term fool cat, when, would it be ridiculous for your character to say cool cat? You can enter it into Ngram and they'll show you how many published works over time use the term cool cat. And, if the line's really low, very flat, you probably shouldn't use it. But if it's up a little higher, you can get away with it. And I think you need to do that kind of work to be sure you don't get these hideous anachronisms where you're, I read one book, it was actually nonfiction, where, the guy wrote that John Adams had a win-win. Well, in the 18th century, there were no win-wins. You just can't use that language. It takes you out of the moment. So you read the people at the time, you read what they wrote, the way they thought about the world, and how they describe each other and how they describe their clothes. And there are sources for that. Google is amazing. This work 30 years ago was a lot harder. But we can now track this stuff down, and it really does help. And I think for me, it's a lot of the fun. And I get a chance to write about more ordinary things than just, what great thing was George Washington trying to do tomorrow. That's interesting too. But this is, how was this family that was scuffling along able to, come up with a viable way to get through the Civil War? I mean, that wasn't easy.
One of the things that I've learned in my public history work, particularly dealing with school children here at Washington Crossing, is even kids as young as 3rd and 4th grade are familiar with the image of Washington Crossing, the Delaware, that I have up in my upper corner here of my screen, from the iconic Leutze painting. And when we tell the story, I start with that because it is, even these young kids are familiar with that image, and I'm able to start a program. When I talk with the kids, I say, kids, what we're going to talk about today is happened right here. And what I'm going to tell you is, and you look at this painting that you're going to see for the rest of your life, this painting is all wrong. And I'm going to tell you what actually happened. And that captures their attention. And the reason why I bring that up is because so much of when I become fascinated in 18th or 19th century art of 18th century happenstance. And you look at the interpretations. Paul Stady's written some wonderful books about 18th century or the 19th century art of the American Revolution. And so much of it is propaganda. But it gives you pause for interpretation. You look at these Trumbull paintings and they may not be accurate, but they tell a story. And now Larry Kidder and I are involved in the Crossing musical, which is another way of telling the story of our history. Fiction is the same way. So, there are different ways of telling history beyond the documentary type of what we read in letters and pension records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that with your earlier series, I mean, I didn't know that much stuff about Babe Ruth, but it was a great story. What a wonderful baseball story, but a mystery to boot, So that was terrific. Moving to the new series, the Overstreet Saga. So you wrote your first 3 that were the mystery series books, and then you came upon the Overstreet Saga. Tell us how that came to be.
Well, they are stories that come from, they're of my mother's ancestors. most of I'm from a very mongrel background, but most of my ancestors are, arrived late in this country and extremely poor. And one part of her ancestry arrived early and also extremely poor. And they arrive in the 1750s. She told a few stories about them. And I don't know if she was just making them untrue because she thought it made a better story, which was something I know she did about other things in the family, or if they had come to her untrue, because that's how family stories get handed down. But when I got old enough to look into the real history, I was able to discover that much of what I thought I knew was not true. So, and it was an interesting experience. They arrive in the 1750s on the coast of Maine. It's the frontier. It's a hideous time. They're under attack. They're German immigrants, all extremely poor. The Germans were very prized settlers in that era because they were poor. They would work really hard for not very much. And they were, much valued for those qualities. And that was true for these people in the town, which became Waldoboro, Maine. And then I was able to take them through the Revolution. And, boy, I didn't know a whole lot about them. I got a lot of mileage out of the fact that I knew one of them was a soldier in the high troops back in Germany, and he was from Hesse. So that meant he was a Hessian soldier. Now, he had never served in America. He came over in the 1750s. But that gave me an idea of who he might have been, both that he had been a soldier, and that was part of his identity, even when he got to the New World. But he stopped being a soldier. He didn't want to keep being a soldier. So, a novelist can get a lot out of that sort of thing. And the time was such a tumultuous time. It was it was a lot of fun to recreate it.
So the new land, and I flashed the cover on the screen for a few minutes, is about Johann Overstreet, who emigrates to the America in 1753, and it brings us through Bunker Hill. So that's where we pick up the new generation of the Overstreet family. I guess it was pretty simple to land on the Civil War, perhaps for the next.
Yeah, well,
story.
that's where the my quest to understand my mother's family started, because she had this great, very lovely ring that when I was about 7, I asked her where it came from. And she said it had been taken off the finger of a dead ancestor on a Civil War battlefield. And I was just totally blown away by what a romantic story that was. This fellow who went and fought for the Union and to free the slaves and dies in the process. And I discovered, of course, it wasn't actually true. He did go fight, and he fought honorably and for a long time. He served for over 2 years. And he was in a very semi-legendary outfit, the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment. However, he did not die on a Civil War battlefield, although he was terribly wounded. And I realized as I got older that the ring she was wearing was not a man's ring. It was a lady's ring. So, I mean, the whole story was mom. And well, that's, we know about that. We used to always say that she never let the facts stand in the way of a good story. But it turned out this guy did have a good story. Both his own trajectory through the Civil War. It's just not every soldier who got leave to go home and get married on Independence Day of 1864. I mean, and that was I mean, I didn't have to make that up. He really did that. And then he joined the sort of emigration west after the war. And, the Civil War veterans were a large part of the Go West young man crowd. A lot of them got home and saw it looked small, the towns they came from, the farms they came from, once they had seen the world or more of the world. And a lot of them were somewhat unsettled by their war experience. We call it PTSD now. They didn't have the language, but they'd had terrible experiences and they had trouble settling down and they were restless. So all of those factors helped me frame this fellow, because I knew he had moved to Chicago and drug his family out there. So that is the rough trajectory of the story.
So let's talk about let's talk about the Burning Land specifically. You started to mention, some of what the story is about. We begin with young Harry Overstreet having some questions about rege militaire, and some of the town's boys are running off to war, and he's really kind of questioning, what this is all about. What drove the men to actually join?
Ultimately, I wish I could say that I thought it was, idealistic fervor to free the slaves, which for, I don't know, maybe 5% of the soldiers it was. But a lot of it was a feeling that the nation was being ripped apart, and that wasn't right, that they were patriots, that they had been raised to believe America was something special and should survive, that it was, our old language, a beacon of the world. And some of it, though, I actually think, and again, I don't mean to make light of it, but I think it was just the sheer adventure of it. That there was a term among the Civil War soldiers that, you needed to go see the elephant, and that was battle. And if you didn't see it, that meant you really didn't live in your generation. And I think that was a factor for quite a few of them, that it was just, that's what was happening, and you were cheating yourself if you weren't part of it. I think once they got into it, they had a very different thought about it. But I think for the fellows who signed up, that was a factor.
And in Burning Land, we have obviously a woman who Harry is very attracted to, who has her own very, well, I don't want to call her opinionated, but she was determined with this cause. That had something to do with it.
Yes, she was Methodist, and it was a classic New England town. The religious spectrum ran from Presbyterian through Methodist to Anglican. Those were the days when Protestant was the only game in town. And the Methodists were generally abolition-minded and anti-slavery. And he is exposed to that in a way that he hadn't been. And it does change him. It's not the only factor, but it does change him. And, we all want to be thought of well by the people we care about. And I think that's a factor. If you want the regard of your peers, the respect of your peers. And I think he, I think he understood that she would not think of him the same way. if he sat out the war. And, an interesting fact was this town, Waldoboro, was a shipbuilding town, and they mostly made ships for the cotton trade, for their customers were Southerners. And in fact, Waldoboro voted against Lincoln both times he ran for president. And they were, a copperhead town, not like much of Maine or much of New England, but they were. So he was an outlier for being willing to go fight. And there were others, of course, but it was a tension in the town. Those of us who've lived through Vietnam know that it is uncomfortable when there is a disagreement as to whether a war is worth fighting, and uncomfortable at home, where you've got people who think it is and people who think it isn't.
I think a lot of people have this view of joining the Army, that you go to training and then you are in battle for a period of time, and then you either survive or come home. You do a marvelous job in Burning Land of being able to explain how the 20th Maine Regiment really spent a lot of time in downtime. Now, you open the Burning Land with this absolutely gripping, horrific scene of Fredericksburg, which anyone who is listening to this Zoom this evening, I challenge anyone not to have your heart in your throat when you read these opening scenes, that only somebody who has been in the heat of battle could possibly imagine how horrific this was. And you don't hold back at all. What kind of research did you do for that opening scene to understand what these Maine boys were living through in those freezing days of December?
Yeah, one of the qualities of the 20th Maine was they came out of the war thinking of them very well of themselves. So they published a lot of their records, their letters and their memoirs. They thought they'd done it. They were proud of what they'd done. And so there are a lot of sources as to what they went through. They also were led by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who became a very significant figure in the war. He was never commanded large armies, but he was a heroic figure. Grant had him accept the surrender at Appomattox. He became that significant. So there's been a lot of attention to them. So there are sources. And Fredericksburg is a battle. There are a few all of the battles are horrible. You can't single one out as, terrible compared to the others. But Fredericksburg stands out for being, for the Union commander, General Burnside, Ambrose Burnside, for having been so stupid and having so miserably sacrificed his men for nothing, that it is an incredibly poignant exercise. He just put them in a position, the commander's job is to put you in a position where you could win. And he never did it. He put them in a position where they couldn't win. And that's why I wanted to start with that scene, because it was the moment, and they were still, this was their first actual fighting for the 20th Maine. They realized they had been essentially betrayed by their own leaders. They had been put in a place where the choice was either die or, if you're lucky, get away. It's pretty harrowing.
It is, that's certainly one of the many words that I can use. I mean, it's horrific, but you know, the old adage about watching a train wreck, I can't help but read on. You want to know what happens. So then we go into some downtime and we begin the series of letter writing that are so prevalent through the book, through the entire book. Harry writing to Katie, and their correspondence is, I mean, seems so real. Was some of that real? I mean, where did that come from?
No, but I read a lot of letters, and the civil, it was a literate generation. They were not poets. Probably most Americans had 4 or 5 years of school, not a ton, but they knew the language. They knew how to write. They knew how to put sentences together. And today our soldiers are in terrible situations, but they also, FaceTime with their families at night. I mean, they are able to connect, and it's a support. It's wonderful that they have. Civil War soldiers had nothing like that. They would go months not hearing from anybody at home, and it was terrifying. And their letters were very careful. They wouldn't generally write about the horrors that they were experiencing. They didn't want to burden people with that. The folks at home were afraid to ask. So there's a sort of delicacy about the letters, a carefulness. And Katie, the female protagonist, is better educated, more of a reader. So I needed to have a contrast between their styles. And again, it was helpful to be able to read letters written at the time to get a sense for how the less educated person would have written. And his letter can still be articulate and powerful, but it's just going to be different in some ways. The punctuation may not be great. Spelling is going to be terrible. But her formulations are going to be different. So I took a lot of care with those. I felt like in the letters you could reveal their characters in a way that dialogue does as well. It's just sort of even more thoughtful dialogue, because when you write a letter, you have time to think about it. I mean, nobody who writes letters. When was the last first class mail you got that was a letter? It's a long time ago. But I remember them fondly because you would try hard, to be entertaining, not stupid, and maybe even if you were writing your girlfriend, sort of charming. Not easy, but you tried.
My audience knows me well enough to know that in these programs, I try not so subtly to hawk my guests' books as best as I can. So I'm going to say it for the first time, that I encourage everybody to go to davidostewart.com and take a look at all of David's books. And if I assure you that once you read The New Land, you'll want to read The Burning Land. But as we are talking about letters, David, if you'll permit me, I have to also point out another new book that has just come out, which I couldn't stop thinking about while I was reading your book. Candace Shy Hooper's Delivered Under Fire is an absolutely fascinating study of Absalom Markland, who made it possible for the train loads of mail that went back and forth, mainly from the federal troops to their families and back. And throughout Burning Land, I mean, there are entire chapters, I think, if I remember correctly, that are letters. And I used the term earlier. I didn't mean to minimize by suggesting that your books are soap operas, but you feel like you're living with these people. And this is how, in Burning Land, I become so close to both Harry and Katie, and what their thoughts and their feelings and their travails and what they're going through on the home front and at camp. So that in and of itself is a history lesson, just reading the letters and the language that you use. Obviously you read a lot of letters, because there seems to be that cadence of language of the 1860s, which is formal, certainly more formal than we're used to, spiritual on many levels. So it's that's another aspect of being able to appreciate fiction that you don't necessarily with nonfiction. I mean, nonfiction, you read a lot of quotes, certainly, what people say, but with these letters that you have essentially made up, you get a real sense of what people feel and what people think. And for that, I think that historical fiction, at least in how you've presented it, is terrific. Many of us have seen the famous film that was made out of Killer Angels, the book about Gettysburg, and Michael Shera's book was in and of itself fiction, and probably one of the most notable pieces of historical fiction, best-selling certainly for decades. And as it was in a dramatic aspect of those 3 days, the defense of the Little Round Tops by the 20th Maine is a searing scene. While the film is exciting in and of itself, you bring it to a whole new level. And I wondered if you might read for us just a little bit of the heat of the battle on the Little Round Tops on July 2nd, 1865. 64.
63.
63, sorry. I'm losing my mind here a little bit. Yeah.
But thank you for the kind words. I thought it was sort of audacious of me and possibly nuts to try to write about something that Shara had written about so well. So I forced myself not to read his book again, so I wouldn't know about it. I wouldn't have it in my head. I'm just going to read a short passage, which is from the pivot moment of the battle. The 20th Maine is on a hillside at the far left end of the Union lines. If they give up their position, the Confederates will be able to put artillery up there and rake the entire Union line. It is thought to have been a potential turning point in the battle that would have allowed the Confederacy to win. And the attackers were an Alabamian regiment that was really experienced, effective, very brave. And they had to attack uphill, which is no fun. And they attacked 5 times. It was really quite a bloodbath on both sides. And I'm just going to read a bit from their last time when it finally shifts. Okay, rifle fire picked up, but no rebel yells. We don't scare off, Henry thought. You know that now. You have to kill us. He ran back to Joe, who was shooting. I should have said Henry's a sergeant here, so he's in the sort of platoon command. The rebels came on slow, using cover, moving back and forth, always uphill. There were so many. Sergeant, Captain Clark's voice rang out in a space between shots. Henry turned. Clark waved his arm up the hill. They were pulling back. Henry jammed his cartridges in his pouch. Up the hill, boys. We'll be back. Up the hill now. He didn't want to stand upright, not with the rebels coming on like that, but he did. He waved down the line in both directions. He turned his back on the enemy, teeth clenched, waiting for a ball to slam into him. He held both arms out and pushed air up the hill. Back 10 spaces, everyone. Go, go. Find new cover. The men scrambled up. To his left, 2 didn't move. 2 more down. He couldn't see who. New line here. Make every shot count. Joe stabbed his ramrod into the earth again. There was blood on his sleeve. Henry moved left to fill the new gap. A grayback ran at him, shouting as a musket fired nearby. The man clutched his side and fell over. Rebels were crossing their line. Henry swung his musket again, connecting with the man's legs. When he fell, Henry dropped on him with his bayonet. The man screamed. Henry screamed. The other man fell silent. Joe was shrieking. He swung his gun one-handed, but missed his target, a rebel who was lifting his gun to fire. Henry jumped on the enemy, his hands searching for the man's windpipe. His fingers slipped on sweaty skin. He had to let go. Henry drove his knee up as he slid off the man, but he connected with nothing. The rebel staggered back. Henry ran at him, reaching blind for a handhold, something he could break or twist or throttle. They fell, knocking the wind from each other. Neither could stand. They stared at each other. The rebel's face was 6 inches away, unshaven, bad teeth. Henry's brain said to move, but he had no air. With a gasp, he inhaled the rock there. He grabbed it and smashed it into the man's face, into yellow teeth. Come on, boys. It was Joe leading the men down the slope. Henry rose to follow. The rebels were running. This time, they were running. So they ended up capturing most of the Alabamians.
So I put up on the screen there for everybody while you were reading, where we are in the battle. I mean, this is the very end of the line. And the 20th Maine is right here at the end. And this is an uphill slog. And the 20th Maine had to hold off the Alabamians who charged, and eventually they ran out of ammunition. And it was a most amazing bayonet attack that saved the day.
It's one of the few true bayonet charges in American history. And until recently, I don't know if it still is, but until recently, it was still being taught at West Point as an example of small group leadership, because Chamberlain got his men through it.
So obviously, Henry getting through this battle, but as is apt to happen, it doesn't get through the war unscathed. And we enter into sort of a new phase of learning, how families react when one of their loved ones suffers in battle. And I think what you move to here after the Civil War is telling us about Western expansion. As you started to say at the beginning of the program, these boys learned a lot more than just war. They learned about the world and what was out there, and what possible opportunities that were out there. What was this? Remind me. I mean, was this a part of what your family did? I mean, were these your ancestors too, or was this something as a part of the novel?
Yeah, no, they moved to Chicago from Maine, and I knew that much. And I knew that he started a new trade. He had been a ship joiner, which is a 19th century term for someone who built woodwork on ships. And there wasn't much call for that in Chicago. So he needed to find something else to do to support his family. And I had the real advantage of having this one, I mentioned that, for the first book, I just knew this one thing about the central character, that he had been a soldier in Germany, and that allowed me to do a lot. And I knew about this fellow, that he did go out there. His wife and two young sons come along. And I know that 50 years later, my mother meets her, ultimately the widow, Katie Nash is the character. And I kept her name. That was her name in real life. And when my mother meets her, she's running a Chinese laundry on the south side of Chicago. She smokes a pipe. It was a African-American neighborhood. And it just, again, it told me so much about the person. And, if you put a gun on my head and said, who's the hero of the story? I would say Katie Nash. She's the one who brings the family through. The war does bad things to Henry. But she's strong and resourceful, and she gets people. And that, knowing her trajectory, she makes it in this amazing, for women in the second half of the 19th century, unless you had education, and of course she only had a modest one, there weren't many economic opportunities. You basically did laundry. That's what you did. You took in men's dirty clothes and washed them. And she didn't whine and cry about it. She didn't yell at people. She got it done. And it's always interesting to me to know some family history about other families too. There's always somebody who provides that upward nudge or shove, who provides the stability, who provides the ambition and the drive to get them started. I know in my father's family, it was my father, but I think in my mother's family, it was Katie Nash. And this book is a bit of a tribute to her.
So you and I don't think we've ever talked about this, but my family comes from Vermont. I don't know if I told you that.
Yeah.
At the same period of time, actually, maybe a little earlier, it was actually before the war, my family moved to Chicago as well. So there were personal parallels there for me. The one thing that you wrote about that I have absolutely no knowledge of with my family is, when we're talking about Chicago in the 1870s, there's that there's that elephant in the room with Chicago that they called the Chicago Fire. So you obviously couldn't write a book about Chicago in the 1870s without the Chicago Fire, and you did it in all of its horrific glory. If we could, let's give the audience a little bit of a taste of that inferno.
Yeah, I mean, the fire comes on at night and people panic and they make a lot of dubious decisions. And that's really what came out as I was doing research. I mean, this is a time when there were a lot of newspapers around and people got a lot of stories down that I could draw on. So Katie and Henry and their two sons are trying to get to the lake. Everybody wants to get to the lake because it's wet and it won't burn. And they're pushing through the streets. Henry's dragging a trunk, which is what people did. A group of five men in dark suits trudged on their left. Each hugged a coffin to his chest. They took a few steps, then stopped and set down their cargo. They took a few breaths. One mopped his forehead with a sleeve, then another few steps. A red-haired girl carried a doll by one leg. No one held the girl's hand. Katie tightened her grip on Thomas. That's the oldest boy. She could feel his hand tug her skirt. An old woman carried a grunting pig who looked to be half her size. Another woman squeezed a quilt to her chest, eyes fixed on the quilt, brushing off any embers the moment they fell. Explosions came from behind. Katie turned her head to look. A rocket of flames soared up close. The fire, voracious, all-powerful, was sprinting to them, gorging on the brittle wood of homes and abandoned possessions, racing to consume stables and sheds and plank sidewalks fed by highways of fire fuel. Another explosion boomed, louder but farther away. Barrels of kerosene or oil, she thought. Maybe paint. Maybe grain elevators. They sometimes had explosions even without fires. Another terrible noise, a crumbling, screaming crash. The building collapsed, walls tumbling amid cries of surprise. Animals screamed. John burrowed her head into her neck. Her arm ached. She wanted to switch the arm that held John, but couldn't risk losing either boy. She held Thomas's hand tight. Across the street, a horse was kicking and screaming. People scrambled to get away, some slipping to their knees as they scurried from the hooves. Dogs howled as they butted through the human legs that blocked their path. Katie felt heat on her back. Smoke stung her eyes and scraped her throat. It was black, coal smoke. The fire had found another fuel. She saw movement from a stable on her right. Rats, big ones, scampering from dark places. A bird exploded in midair, reduced to a black thing that dropped to the scalding earth. Glancing back, Katie gasped as a building ignited. The fire didn't start in one corner or on its roof. It didn't spread step by step. The whole structure simply flared like a giant match head. One moment it was solid, the next moment it was an exultation of flame that released blazing cyclones into the sky. She squinted against the glare of red and orange. They shuffled on.
Wow. I gotta say, we watch movie trailers and you're often with some films are given the best part of the story away. These two passages that you read to us, and I've read the book several times, are only two of many terrific passages. Not all of them are as packed with action as you've read to us, but there is certainly action of another sort. One couldn't possibly write an entire novel with this kind of nonstop action, because that's not what life is about. But you managed to, throughout the Burning Land, you've managed to tell us a story that has both action and introspection. And I think that you've done a great service, because like any good writer, you keep our attention, and like any good historian, you teach us stuff.
Thank you. I do, there were, for me, some of my favorite passages were when Henry's in the hospital.
Yeah.
Recovering. And, it's a quiet time. It's kind of a miserable time, but the hospital experience was central to the
book.
for soldiers. A lot of them ended up there.
Well, at the risk of just rattling off a lot of superlatives, David, I encourage everyone to seek out all of David's novels and his nonfiction. Get to know this writer, folks, ladies and gentlemen. I learned from him, and I am entertained by him, and it's rare that when you can be both entertained and learn at the same time. And David is really one of my favorite writers, and that's why I'm thrilled to have him with us this evening. As you all know, I spend most of my time in the 18th century, with David's book, The Burning Land. I took a foray into the 1800s, and I encourage you to do the same. David, I certainly look forward to whatever it is that you're doing next. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, sure. It's another change. I've decided in my dotage that doing different things is what I should be doing. So I've gotten fascinated by the Stockholm Olympics of 1912. An amazing cast of characters. It was the Jim Thorpe Olympics. It was George Patton, our great general, was a contestant. Duke Kahanamoku, a great Hawaiian swimmer and surfer, and also the only man to win an Olympic medal and the Nobel Peace Prize, is Philip Noel Baker. And their stories are amazing. The Olympics themselves were fascinating. So it's a big departure for me, but it's fun, a lot of fun.
Well, that's terrific. You've sold a copy to me. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And this show was a little different. But I've got some other great shows coming up in July and August, so keep your eyes at historyauthortalks.com. In the meantime, go take a look at thecrossingmusical.com and listen to some of our music that we have coming up for our musical in production. We're very proud of this work. As always, as I remind you, please be sure to go to your favorite bookseller or online and purchase books by David O. Stewart. And I hope to see you all next time. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you for having me, Roger.
It's great to see you, David. Take care.
Bye-bye.